Hello, welcome to this episode of the DHF podcast. I'm Sam Sears. I'm a DHF board member and a church planner, actually the first DHF church plant, and so I'm really excited about that. Many of you know that by now, by the time that this episode comes out. And DHF is a ministry, if you're joining us for the first time, that seeks to equip churches to do what they're called to do. And it's a ministry of over 150 and growing churches. And we are excited to just have these little extra bits of information and fellowship between our pastor Zooms and our annual conference and all those kinds of things, which you can learn more about at discipleheritage.org. And I have with me a regular co-host and also a fellow church planner and part of our church plant team. Chris, why don't you say hi?
Hey everybody, it's Chris Henderson. I know you guys are used to me saying I'm the lead pastor of Windsor Christian Church, but as Sam already noted, by the time of this podcast being released, I will be probably on the ground in Clarksville, Tennessee, and will be the executive pastor of the Stone Christian Church.
And then we have with us Olin Giles, and he's with a ministry called Radical Truth. I'll let him introduce himself in just a minute, but I wanted to say for you listeners, we have had Tony Goulet on before, who's also with Radical Truth in a previous episode. And I think I shared then, but I first met the Radical Truth ministry through its founder, Joe Carey, who went on to be with the Lord many years ago. And a dear man, wonderful teacher, a great passionate heart to reach Muslims. And he was going through, and I was with another church plant at the time. The first time I tried a church plant, we combined two little plants, and he called us up and said, hey, at the time I was the associate pastor, kind of what Chris is going to be doing. And he said, hey, I'm going to be in the area and I want to come and share and just equip your little body with maybe how to evangelize Muslims nearby. And I loved it. And it was great to learn about his ministry. And I worked with Tony through Ratio Christi, and so it was great to see him and that same connection. And then now Olin has joined the team, and I am thankful for that particular ministry because it's such a large, unreached people group, and they're coming to us, and that excites me. So we hope you learned something today as you listen to the podcast. Olin, why don't you just kind of tell us about yourself and how you got connected with Radical Truth? I think you were connected actually before I was, and you knew Joe Carey as well.
That's right, yes. One of the first trips that I took to Dearborn was with Joe Carey and Tony. But I'm 58 years old. My wife and I were getting ready to celebrate our 40th wedding anniversary in June.
Oh, congrats.
We're enjoying the empty nest. But I didn't come to know the Lord until late in life. I grew up as a PK, or preacher's kid, as they say, and I rebelled as a young man and rejected the Lord. But as you know, the Lord has a way of getting your attention. So after a series of accidents, I come to realize that either I was going to come to Christ or he was going to take me out of this world. So at the age of 33, my wife led me to the Lord one night after praying for me for well over 10 years. And my life was changed. I tell people I was the greatest introvert in the world, but by the grace of God, I almost immediately had a love for people and a desire to learn and grow. Graduated high school in 1983 with no plans to ever go to college. Spent 10 years of my life, never read a book. But the Lord also, almost immediately gave me a desire to learn and to grow. And I'm now working on my second master's degree at Veritas International University with Dr. J. Smith and Dr. Janasic. And as you said today, I'm a missionary, trainer, and speaker with Radical Truth. I'm an evangelist at heart. It's funny how God has changed me in this way. I went from avoiding people at all costs to now actively pursuing them and trying to engage them in gospel conversations. I travel around to places like Dearborn, Michigan, or wherever God opens the door. And, as you alluded to earlier, my heart is not just to reach Muslims with the gospel, but, I want to see the American church equipped and ready to respond as well. So that's just a little bit about me.
I wanted to call attention to that, your wife praying for you for 10 years. I don't know if we have any listeners going through that. I know I prayed for my dad for a long time. And it's always wonderful to hear those reminders to keep praying for our loved ones that maybe aren't following right now, because that matters.
Well, you mentioned Dearborn, so I figured I'd ask the question, how did Dearborn, Michigan become so heavily populated with a Muslim population?
Well, let me just say that I'm in no way an expert on the history of Dearborn, but it's a good question, and I've been curious about it myself, and so I've looked into it a little bit. And what I've found is that, even though there were some Syrian Christian immigrants that came in the early 1900s, there eventually were some other immigrants that Henry Ford in the automotive industry brought into this area, and he would eventually attract a lot of European and different immigrants from different places. From what I've learned, by the 1920s, these immigrants were mostly Muslims from southern Lebanon. But here's the most important part, I think, for us today is, according to a 2023 survey, Dearborn became the first Arab majority city in the United States, with roughly 55% of the city's 110,000 people claiming Middle Eastern or North African ancestry. So these people are not going away. And I think this is just one of many American cities that are, currently being transformed both culturally and religiously. I remember my first visit there. I just mentioned going with Joe Carey. It was definitely culture shock for me, so to speak, and I was surprised at how unique this place was. I never thought there was anywhere like this in America. For example, there's Arabic writing on the billboards, magazines, and papers. Wherever you look, you see Arabic writing. I went into a grocery store, and it's on the shelves. Practically every restaurant that I went into had a halal sign in the window. And at one time, Dearborn had the largest mosque in the United States. There's a big Shia mosque there, but that's not the case anymore. Anyhow, it's just a completely different culture, and I had never experienced anything like that before. And just in case somebody's wondering, it was a very pleasant experience for the most part. The food was excellent. So I say that because I don't think we should boycott or avoid these type of cities or these type of restaurants as Christians, but I would recommend going in, enjoy a meal, and try to start a conversation with the waiter or waitress. You're going to hear me say this numerous times today, perhaps, but most Muslims love to talk about God or Jesus. And as Christians, we should be really intentional about starting these conversations.
Dearborn is kind of infamous, if you're in the apologetics world, for how heavily concentrated Islam is there. And so you hear stories about people taking trips and just kind of the culture shock there. I know for me, I grew up in a small town in Kentucky originally, moved around a couple of times, but it wasn't until I was an adult in Ohio that I even kind of heard in the back off streets of a place that had halal meat and that kind of thing. But I visited Clarksville, and they had a sign in this Egyptian place that they had halal meat. And I walked in. Took me a few minutes to look at the pictures on the wall and ask some questions. Turned out, even though the person that was actually our waitress didn't have the tattoo, they were all Coptic Christians. And so it was neat to have that conversation because, I have a tattoo that's actually slightly larger than the authentic one of Coptic Christians. But yeah, halal food was actually really delicious. Maybe you don't want to know why it's halal and the process that the cows go through to die to make it halal, but it was actually good. It was a great conversation to have. But speaking of Muslims in general, you mentioned you're an evangelist at heart. Why Islam specifically? Why Muslims specifically?
Well, ultimately, I have to answer that question in saying that God called me to do this. That's the only way I can explain it. But I think it's important that we make the distinction between Islam and a Muslim, because I think a lot of Christians struggle here. So I want to do that. We focus on Muslims because these are people that are made in the image of God. They're people whom Christ died for. They need to hear the real message of the gospel. They need to hear the good news of Jesus Christ. So we love Muslims, but we don't love Islam. The Bible says that God desires all men to be saved, and they have to come to the knowledge of the truth. Islam represents the single largest threat to the Christian gospel. There are 1.8 to 1.9 billion people in the world who follow Islam. And again, what I want to emphasize here is, and you've already said it as well, that these people are now coming to us. This is something that I emphasize continually. What an incredible opportunity that God has given us as a church. We've spent thousands of dollars sending missionaries overseas, and rightfully so. I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't be doing these things, and that we shouldn't have this type of missional perspective. But we know that we're called to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. But again, right now they're coming to us. No Christian in America has to travel very far to find a Muslim. They're now our doctors, lawyers, taxi drivers, etc. Practically every major university in America has a Muslim student association. And all you have to do is watch the news to see that they're being very influential. But I just want to emphasize again the fact that God has brought these people to us, and I believe God has done it, and He's done it for a reason. And it's just such an incredible opportunity for us as a church to share the gospel with them at a minimal cost. We don't have to travel very far. We don't have to spend a lot of money. And so I believe the answer to radical Islam is a well-equipped church, ready and able to defend the historical Christian gospel.
Hey, even Richard Dawkins agrees with you now. So
Yeah,
that's pretty nice. For those who don't know who that is, it's a well-known atheist who is one of those new atheists, very aggressive, but has now said, well, I'm a cultural Christian, and Christianity is a bulwark against something much worse. And so he's seeing the Islamization of Europe is there a few years in front of us. So I appreciate that answer very much.
And I know you talked about how Islam is the greatest threat to the Christian gospel right now. And so I'm going to ask a question, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit on how specifically Islam threatens that. But since we're talking about witnessing or evangelism, how would you define the gospel? And then from that, how does Islam really stand as that greatest threat?
yes, it's a great question. And I've found that a lot of Christians don't seem to understand what this term means a lot of times. Of course, the word gospel comes from the Greek word euangelion, which means good news. And I think it's a message to be spoken, proclaimed, preached, etc. These are all biblical terms. So it's a verbal message. Now, I'm not saying that our lifestyle or what we do is not important. Obviously, it is. It's crucial that we practice what we preach. That's important as well. But I'm defining the gospel. It's a message that, on the most basic level, includes three things: the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is the message that makes Christianity unique. We have sinned against an infinitely holy and righteous God. Therefore, what we need is His righteousness. And this gift is precisely what Christ, the God-man, gives us by the grace of God through faith. So these things matter. The deity of Christ matters. But as I mentioned, so does the substitutionary death on the cross. One of the first Bible verses that I memorized was 2 Corinthians 5:21. It says that God made Him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So he lived the life that we can never live, and then he died in our place. But of course, 3 days later, he arose victoriously, and one day we're going to have a glorified body just like him. So again, deity, death, and resurrection. These are all fundamentals of the Christian faith. But Islam rejects all three of these. And, I've often said that the most powerful lie in the world is one that gets as close as possible to the truth while still remaining a lie. And this is exactly what Islam does. So it doesn't matter how many similarities that Islam has. We can certainly use these to build bridges and have meaningful conversations. But we need to keep in mind that they deny these essential teachings of the gospel message, these fundamentals of the Christian faith that we can't compromise.
You mentioned it's a verbal message, and I know that when I think it was St. Francis of Assisi who this is ascribed to, preach the gospel at all times when necessary, use words. I understand the intent that it was a call to live out the life and not just, be doers, not just saying something, but actually walk the walk. I understand that intent, but so often today I hear that, and in my mind I hear feed the hungry when necessary, use food. It has to be a verbal message. Yes, walk consistently as an ambassador, but we have to get these things across. And you're right, Islam, they see Jesus as a teacher. They'll talk about Isa and they'll talk highly about him, but they don't understand that he is the promised Messiah, the King. And that's close, but not enough.
Right, absolutely.
Let me ask you this, because I really liked what you had to say about the gospel and its simplicity and yet importance at the same time. Sam made a great point that they do acknowledge Jesus, just not how we see him. But how does theology and our mission correlate with one another? How important is this if we're talking about evangelism, not just to Muslims, but even on the greater extent that our theology matches our missiological efforts?
Yeah, such a great question. And again, there's a lot of controversy surrounding, what we're talking about here. But, just to answer your question in a very simple way, I would say that our missiology should correspond with our theology. I mean, all you have to do is read Matthew 28. I mean, you look at Matthew 28, and you find this baptismal formula of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. You find Jesus Christ, who is going to be with us always, even till the end. You find the deity of Christ and the triunity of God. So it's tempting to compromise these things and to kind of water them down a little bit, I think, when we're talking to our Muslim friends. But we can't do that. I mean, at least not for very long. So we want to have good biblical theology in focus when we're having these conversations with Muslims, and I think I'll talk about this maybe a little bit more here in a moment, but just such an important question.
Yeah, and going just a step further, if you would, you mentioned the Trinity, which is super important. I think sometimes you're right, we water it down because it becomes challenging for us when we're faced with those questions. But how have you personally fleshed that out with a Muslim who would say that we believe in three different gods, even though we know that that's not the triune formula, but I know that's an argument that oftentimes will be made. So how do you kind of work through that with those that you encounter from the Muslim faith?
Yeah, I don't let them define my terms. I mean, they define the Trinity, in the way that the Quran tells them to. They have this perspective of what they think Christianity teaches. And so they think that we are tritheistic or polytheistic. We worship multiple gods. But, and this is a huge obstacle to them, and one that you're going to have to deal with if you're going to, if you're going to have a conversation with a Muslim. And of course, I like to listen to what each individual Muslim is struggling with. I want to take the time to listen and not just jump to any different objection that I think they may have. But when dealing with the Trinity, I just, again, define my own terms that we don't believe in three gods, but we believe in a triunity, namely the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And I'm very hesitant to, try to illustrate this in any kind of way, but I think the simplest way to do this with a Muslim is just to use a triangle. I mean, just as a triangle has three sides, there are three persons within the Godhead. These are not persons in the same sense that obviously we are persons. We don't read persons into God, but we know that we are persons because we're made in the image of God. So that's just one way that I try to illustrate the Trinity to them, and ultimately that's going to break down. I realize that, but it just helps them understand that their objection to this unity in diversity is fallacious.
Touching on two really important issues that actually have so much impact beyond the Islam discussion and witnessing to Muslims, because a lot of folks inside of the church don't really know how to articulate the gospel well. And so, like, we have interviewed theologian Matthew Bates on that a while back. I think he brings a lot of clarity on that. With Scott, who's the kind of the other main host, he'll do a run of episodes, and I'll do a run of episodes. But I got to be on that with him. And then the Trinity, a lot of folks inside the body are still confused at how to share about the Trinity or what the Trinity is. And our friend of the show, Evan Minton, he's done a big, long series of articles kind of defending the Trinity. And I think it's something worth digging into. But I really appreciated you not guessing their objection, but trying to know what that individual's objection or issue is. You don't want to introduce another one. You don't want to confuse them. But if you listen to them, you can meet them where they are. And that's practical with whoever we're sharing the gospel with.
If I could add just a little bit more, I won't go too long, but, I was just thinking as you were talking that, I think Christians and Muslims both can agree that God is a timeless, spaceless, immaterial spirit. And so, the Bible says that Jesus, in John 1:18, that Jesus reveals the Father. So he basically exegetes him, is what it says. He explains the Father. So I think that's helpful to move the conversation in the right direction as well. It's not three gods, but it's the co-equal, co-eternal Son of God, whom the Father sent, who explains God and who he is. And just one more thing as well, too, I just thought of it, that we can get around a lot of these objections to the Trinity by going back to the Old Testament. Genesis 18:1, where Yahweh appears before Abraham. A few chapters later, a few verses later, Yahweh in heaven, or Yahweh on earth, rains fire and brimstone out of heaven with Yahweh. So it's these kind of cut out some of their objections before they even get to them, if we start with the Old Testament.
There's a wonderful book called The Two Powers in Heaven by a Jewish man, Rabbi Segal. I first heard it through Dr. Michael Heiser, but it really chronicles that there was an understanding even in the Old Testament that there was one God, and yet there was at least two powers, and sometimes you'd see them interacting as the angel of the Lord, and that does cut through. Also, at the risk of going long or introducing another tangent, when dealing with Islam in particular, I think of their tawhid, their strict oneness. That God hasn't experienced love until he created. There's a lack there. Hasn't loved anyone until he's created something. Whereas the Trinity, all three persons of the Trinity experience love and unity for all time. They didn't lack something. They didn't need something. They were complete. And I just think that's a superior, just if you did the chart, it's a superior God, not to mention that it's the correct view and the one true God. So I always try to bring that up if I'm in, and I have been in a debate with Muslims as we compare our understandings of God. But I've kind of introduced a tangent, forgive me, but I love talking about that. we started out with Dearborn, and maybe Dearborn specifically. What are some of the ways that you have interacted and engaged with Muslims to share the gospel with them?
We've done some. We've tried multiple ways of trying to reach Muslims there. We've engaged in door-to-door evangelism, but I think this was probably the least effective in Dearborn. Most of the Muslims never answered the door. And when we were 2 or 3 houses down, we would see them get in their car and leave. And then there were some who worked third shift, and we woke them up, so they were just mad when they realized who we were. But some of the more effective methods was just a good old-fashioned vacation Bible school. We've done this at a church last year, and it was such a beautiful sight to see these mostly Muslim women in their hijabs come into the church and their children with them, and to see them interacting with our workers and carrying around Bible verses and singing songs and, just doing all the things that you would expect from a vacation Bible school. There's food, music, and lessons. But we also did, we also do an annual Arab Chaldean festival event in Detroit. We set up a tent, and as people are coming into this Arab festival, we invite them to come and answer some questions, which are basically a gospel presentation. And last year, we gave away a couple of widescreen TVs. And by the way, this is Ministry to Muslims that's doing this. You can find out more information about Ministry to Muslims at ministrytomuslims.com. But we gave away some TVs and some bikes and a lot of things to attract the children. And so they had to, in order to get these prizes, they had to answer these questions. And I found this to be very effective. I mean, we had well over 300 conversations with people from all over the world, and we even had some professions of faith. There were a few who claimed to be Christians that had misunderstood the gospel. They thought it was much like, any other religion based on works. So it was a great privilege to be able to clarify the gospel with them, as well as see these other people come to Christ. So this was a very encouraging event for me, and we're planning on doing it again this year in July. Lord willing, we'll go back.
Yeah, and with us being pastors, at least most of those that are listening, what are some things that you've seen that churches are doing well in that area, or in areas in general? But then also, what are some things that churches could do that can be improved upon? How should the church respond to this mission field that's, as you and Sam have both stated multiple times, right in our backyards?
Yeah, I mean, the church is the answer. I think I've already said it, but the answer to radical Islam is a well-equipped and church that is ready to engage unbelievers with the gospel. And there's several churches in the Dearborn area that are, very intentionally and strategically trying to reach these Muslims. And they're doing it, of course, through various ways. Some of them have ESL programs. I think this is a great way to meet a need and then share Christ's servant evangelism. Other churches that come to mind are Dearborn Baptist Church and Pastor Josh there. They organize what is called the Christ Is Conference, where they invite in imams and certain Islamic leaders to discuss certain topics. They don't do this, of course, on a Sunday morning. This is an event, and they invite in the imams so that they get the Muslim audience. Churches down in Florida are doing something very similar. So this is a great method, I think. The church down in Florida that I'm talking about, they had an event where the pastor talked about the biblical Jesus, and then the imam discussed the Jesus or Isa of the Quran, and then they had a Q&A afterwards. And of course, there was some apologetics and some historical evidence thrown in there. So anytime I think you can bring these two groups of people together, Christians and Muslims, to discuss, who is Jesus or any other important topic, that's what we need to be doing. We want to, equip churches to do these things, and not just engage Muslims, but I think it's very important that we equip each individual member of the church to do what needs to be done, whether it's out in the workplace, or if they're engaging Muslims at a restaurant, or as they go about their daily life. I think, all across America, much of the evangelistic responsibility is being put on pastors and church leaders. But my heart is to see, again, the overall body of Christ equipped and doing these things. And I know that's your heart as well. We all have different gifts and abilities, but every church member is a missionary to some extent, or at least they should be.
I really pray that a lot of our churches move past the old school mindset that I grew up in, where missions was something that we sent money to.
Yeah.
Missionaries were somebody that went overseas, and moved to the mindset that we are a missional community and that every one of us is a missionary where we are. And that's discipleship. That's a biblical model, and we need to get back to that.
That's the key.
I wanted to ask one question that is really culturally relevant today. We've got a lot of things going on right now with Palestine. We've got a lot of things going on inside the church with LGBTQ issues. And even then, I kind of want to unpack both of those things. And I know we don't have time necessarily, but a lot of our audience does. And you can ask more questions and reach out to us. But one of the things that I've seen is like Queers for Palestine and stuff like that. And my understanding of Islam and the way that is viewed, whereas we as a Christian, we're going to go, I love you. Many of us are even going to go like, hey, look, politically, we're not trying to outlaw your relationship necessarily, but we want you to know that God didn't design you that way, and we want you to know God, and that's much freer. We would say things like, or I've said things like, you don't find your identity in who you find sexually attractive, find your identity in Christ. But Islam's different. And this kind of thing is blowing my mind. Can you comment on Islam's view of homosexuality? Because I'm not sure that our culture understands it. It seems like there's two opposing ideas there that are being celebrated at the same time by some folks.
Yeah. Islam is very hostile to to this type of lifestyle. And this is, unfortunately, this is where Islam has done, this might even be a controversial statement, but I think it's true. This is where Islam has done a much better job than we have in fighting this battle of ideas, even though they're putting forth this lie, this narrative that the God of the Quran, the Allah of the Quran, would accept these type of people. The Hadith literature, which is the traditional sayings of Muhammad, these writings are filled with things about unbelievers in general to, gay and lesbian people. They're not treated very well. We know that. We see that, in places like Iran or Iran. And so, this idea that Allah is a loving God and that, that you can, it just makes no sense. I mean, that Allah would accept these type of people. He doesn't even accept unbelievers in general. There's nowhere in the Quran that he says that he loves unbelievers. And you mentioned earlier that the God of the Bible is the solution. The God of the Bible doesn't change. He is love, is what 1 John 4:8 says. And therefore we love all people. But that's not the case with Islam. And we see this being played out with Muslims, unfortunately. They don't tolerate this type of lifestyle in an Islamic country. I mean, they don't even allow unbelievers into Mecca, much less these type of people.
I think of dear family members, and I might get called a name because I want to see them come to Jesus, and I'd like them to live a different lifestyle. And yet at the same time, there's people who I know want them stoned or thrown off a building. And they're okay with them. And I'm going, there's some real cognitive dissonance there. It's frustrating to me. So it's a challenge.
Well, we've got to do a much better job, I think, of, I do this on a daily basis, and I'm hesitant to even say this, but a lot of the flack that I get is from professing Christians just by exposing Islam. I love Muslims. I love people in general. I don't hate anybody, but we have got to do a better job of exposing what the Quran and what Muhammad taught as far as these topics go. I think as Christians, we've got to expose this darkness and show them a better way in the God of the Bible and Jesus.
I really wish those people that say all religions are equal would sit down and compare the lives of Muhammad and Jesus.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Is that
it drives me nuts when people say that, because it's so obviously false.
Yeah.
But I could go on, and we'll definitely have you on again, because as an apologist, this kind of stuff is my bread and butter, and I do love reaching Islam, and I love the idea that the mission field is coming to us.
Yeah.
That's an amazing opportunity, and so we should make the most of that, right? And it sounds like a lot of churches, if you're having VBS, make sure you're inviting your Muslim neighbors to VBS. Sounds like that's a great place to start.
So first and foremost, thanks again for hopping on here with us today. I know this is Sam's geek category, if you would, and so hey, it's even on the website. He calls himself a nerd for Jesus and owns it, so I'm not going to get in trouble for saying that. Where can people find out more information about you and your ministry with Radical Truth?
Well, of course, they can go to radicaltruth.net. We have lots of resources there, lots of news articles. There's ways to contact us on the website. We have a YouTube channel as well that we would love you to take a look at. I have one personally for myself. It's called Why Christianity? Why Christianity 8388. YouTube added those numbers for whatever reason, but you probably won't find me unless you add those numbers on. But would love to hear from anybody that has comments or questions. I'll even give out my email if you'd like. It's jcmin@live.com. And again, we'd love to hear from you and help you in any way that I can.
I'm so thankful you're on board with Radical Truth. Tony often hits folks in a different area of the country than you are, and we have a whole lot of churches that we know are kind of connected to us or listen to the podcast or come to the DHF conference that are more towards your area of the country. And so I'm hoping that introducing you to them is a good thing, and we can make some connections there. So we do encourage you guys to follow up. But this has been this episode of the DHF podcast. You can find out more about our ministry at discipleheritage.org. I'm thankful for folks like Fred and Crystal who will edit and work on the thumbnail for this particular episode. And if you appreciate their work or the work that we do, we would love a like, a subscribe, a share on YouTube. We love those comments. So please do that. That helps get our reach out to more people. And we hope you've had a good one and enjoyed this episode. God bless you, and we'll catch you next time.